Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. Today I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Sarah Ann Macklin, registered nutritional scientist, TEDx speaker, founder of the Be Well Collective, and host of the brilliant Live Well, Be Well podcast and YouTube channel. Sarah has had hundreds of conversations with leading thinkers from all walks of life, including most recently a truly wonderful interview with Professor Paul Gilbert, which I'll pop in the description below. In this episode, we explore Sarah's remarkable journey from international model to health visionary and how she champions a 360 multidimensional view of health, one that integrates nutrition, sleep, mental well-being, and importantly, compassion. It's a conversation about role models, resilience, and rethinking what it truly means to live well and be well. I found our chat inspiring, thoughtful, and full of heart, and I think you will too. And so I bring you Sarah Ann Macklin. Excellent. Sarah Ann Macklin, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to start actually with an important question because in your TEDx talk, you mentioned your dad saying dogs are better than cats. And, I have to know, do you fully agree with that? Or what, has your stance softened over the years?
I love how it's starting with this. No, dogs for me, I've grown up with dogs my entire life. And I've never had cats, but for me, it's that lovable loyalty and affection
Mm,
that a dog gives. Whereas I think a cat's a bit more like a flatmate, where they're kind
yes,
of like, I'll hang out with you when I fancy it, but when I don't, leave me alone.
yes.
And so for me, it's always dogs that come up trumps.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I had a Labrador who's gone now, but yes, he's definitely my compassionate friend, if you like, and certainly was when he was around, and he stays with me in kind of the imagery of all of that. So, but we also have two cats, so yeah, there you
Oh, well,
go.
I actually did a podcast the other day. It's called The Hidden 20%, and it's all about people with neurodivergency. And the founder or the host was the person who started Seedlip, that non-alcoholic botanicals drink. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but
Mm,
it kind of
mm,
took the non-alcoholic market by storm and kind of started like 20 years ago. Anyway, he found out he was autistic, so he started this podcast called Hidden 20%. And he
mm,
always makes somebody bring on something that's good for their brain. So I think he started off his first episode with Kit Harington, and obviously they're
mm.
all bringing like quite interesting kind of things to the show. Anyway,
Yes.
I bought my dog,
Oh, you did.
and he was like, "This might be the first time we've ever had a live animal on set." But I
Uh,
was like, "He's really good for my brain." I
ah,
find him very calming. So
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Was that a sort of an in-studio session, and you brought your dog into that?
I brought the dog in. It was chaos. It was chaos, but wonderful
Yeah.
chaos.
Yes, yes. No, I'm very much a doggish person as well, and so good. I'm glad we straightened that out. But speaking of your dad, you also posed in the TEDx talk. What is a role model? He was an important role model for you,
Mm.
I think, and I suppose, yeah, I wondered if we could kind of start there a bit, actually. What is being a role model mean to you, sort of now as you've kept thinking about all of that?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question today more than ever before because I think there's not much, well, I think because of the rise of social media, there's not as much authenticity in the world. And I think many people now are going through a bit of an identity crisis of trying to figure out who they are. And that's definitely something that I had when I was young, being a model at a very young age, of trying to like fit into certain characters to feel accepted. And I definitely went through that. And I think, we can very much look up today to certain people, whether it's within sport, whether it's in music, whether it's in the arts, and look at people. But, that authenticity can be very, very hard to capture. And so, yeah, in my TEDx talk, I did speak about actually all of these role models that I had looked up to. But actually, the person who had the most influence on my life was my dad. And he was obviously sat straight in front of me, and I'm very
Yeah.
lucky that I had him. Um, but I think, the identity crisis that I feel like many of us can feel that we're in is something where the role model can become very skewed. Um, and I think there's a lot of mistrust now, especially online. And so I think, the role models for us should be the people that we surround ourselves with, people that inspire us, people that like challenge us, that ask, make us grow, make us rethink our behavior, make us reflect. I think they're like our true moral models because they're the people that actually see us. And I think if we can challenge ourselves to be better people through those people that influence us, around us, then there to me are the most kind of influential role models.
Mm. We're sort of hungry for it, aren't we, in a way that society has
Mm,
shifted about, and it's not quite as perhaps once it was, where the role models and the heroes even and so on would come from the much more local community, maybe, or but
mm,
now we see these people on perhaps online, but they're sort of they might be good role models in a way, but they're also so distant, I suppose, that it can be hard to really have that tangible sense of them in our lives. And then of course there are others online that perhaps we kind of follow, but perhaps aren't so much good role models.
mm.
I've just finished watching Adolescence. Have you got to that TV show yet?
Gosh, this has been on topic of conversation with a lot of my friendship group this week.
Yeah,
I haven't yet actually. My
yeah,
my parents asked me if I'd watched it as well. I actually haven't watched it.
yes,
But I've heard a lot of the conversations around. I mean, it's quite terrifying.
yes.
Especially, I mean, I don't have children, but I think anyone who's got children and watches that is also it's quite a worrying watch about what to do with social media and the rise of everything.
Yes, it sort of addresses the kinds of things you're saying, the way that we try to seek out role models, and sometimes that can really have a problematic side to it, and also it
Yeah.
addresses the topic really of kind of sort of online bullying and the way that people might relate to one another online through coded emojis and various other things that
Yeah.
kind of become a real source of suffering. All of this becomes a real source of suffering.
Yeah, I guess that's the worrying thing about online is that you don't really know who you're talking to half the time,
Mm,
and that's the worrying part, I think, of what I've heard about that show. But I
mm.
haven't seen it yet. It's one that I will watch, but I think I've got to be in the right mindset to watch that show.
It's hard hitting and but excellently produced and acted and so on. But yeah, so role models really people in our orbit who can sort of challenge and extend and kind of open us up to things, but also offer support and comfort and and all of that. Your journey
Mm.
from modeling to studying nutrition, then it sort of launched the Be Well Collective. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that journey and that sort of that moment where you realized things had to change.
Yeah, it's quite funny actually because I've spoken about this in the last year a lot more recently. I mean, I don't think I'd spoken outwardly for such a long time. And I think it's really important that when you go through maybe a huge change in your life and you're in the midst of figuring out that you really have to process everything you go through. And sometimes when you're going through massive, drastic life changes, nothing really makes sense as to why you're doing it, but you're just, trying to trust that process. And I remember for years people being like, you should talk about this more. But I think I still didn't really understand actually why I was doing all of this. It just was one of these things that I decided to jump straight on into and change a career when I was actually at the top of one a career, which many people would say, well, why would you leave something that's thriving? But my mum actually called me about it this week. And we actually had this very kind of in-depth conversation, which was really lovely because although I've spoken about it outwardly, I've maybe never spoken to her about it. And it was actually very interesting to hear her perspective, who was the person who, my parents stood through me through all my changes. And it was very interesting to hear her reflection on how she saw me. Um, and, for context of listeners, I was, spotted as a model when I was 16. I had a very successful career. I was very lucky. I lived all over the world. I was back and forth between here and New York. I was shooting for, huge, huge household names brands that many people would know. And then at 23, my body kind of had what someone would call now like habitual burnout. And I was hospitalized and I was riddled with septicemia and sepsis. And E. coli, and that caused me to have rigors where like your kidney doesn't process everything because it's obviously full of septicemia, which would give me like these kind of like, you would call them like, they'd look like a seizure, but your body would just like shake convulsively. And it was so bad that they had to get two microbiologists to sign off the one antibiotic that was left to kind of helicopter down from Scotland to London. So it was so severe, like they couldn't figure out. And if it was left any longer, like I wouldn't have made it. And I was in hospital for a very long time, and I was very, 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 very thin. And, you know, when I spoke to my mum about it the other day, she was like, just the pressure that you'd put on yourself and the pressure to maintain, this like this image of what everyone expected of you. And it's, I kind of, unbeknown to me before this, went through school not diagnosed as neurodivergent and had very severe dyslexia. So for me, I was, told that I was good at something for the first time, paid an incredible amount of money, mixing with some of the most like interesting people in the world. This is a world that I didn't think was ever going to be on offer to me. And I was so terrified to lose it. So I lost myself in the entire process. And then my dad had a brain hemorrhage, and that was only 6 months after. So my mum was kind of trying to navigate looking after me and my dad. And it was that moment when I kind of looked at him in ICU and thought that I was here 6 months before and nearly lost my life. And now my dad's fighting for his with a bleed on his brain. And it was this moment that I had. I don't know if you've ever had this, but the frustration when you see someone who's really ill and all you want to do is help them get better. And you can see kind of the problems that they've had. And he had a very high stressful job. He put a lot of pressure on himself. And I wanted to kind of shake him and be like, why don't you sort this out? And then it was a bit of a reflective process on me, on actually, this must be something that I've got to sort out. And being in an industry that was very focused on how you looked, like how thin you were, how tall you were, how perfect your skin was, all of these things where you put so much pressure on yourself. I was like, I was on a mission to go and figure that out for myself, and wanted to get my body back. So the kind of initial step was to go back to school and study nutritional science and understand this. And this was like 10 years ago, where like ironically, people might not remember this, but like health and wellness, especially in the UK, wasn't a big thing. So
Mm.
I went back to understand more about that. And that's when I got my diagnosis with dyslexia. And that's when like my whole world changed. For me, it was that one moment where someone had told me that I wasn't stupid and I was smart. And I started to have these connections between mental health and physical health and understanding, how our minds really change our physiology and our biology. And the reason why I was in hospital wasn't because of just one thing. It was a whole load of situations of stress that I'd put my body under where I just decided to stop. And that was then my mission, to educate, to learn, to communicate, and to start unraveling this like world that for me had just opened up like a Pandora's box. And I was just shocked that no one was talking about it, thinking about it, wanting to talk about preventative health, and connecting the mind and the body, which I had become completely disconnected from. My mind was not connected to my body. They were two separate entities. Um, and I never realized like the pressure that I'd put on myself or how I saw myself. So for me, nutrition was like my starting vehicle into like the world of health.
Mm. I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because you did achieve a lot of success. There was a lot of sort of very positive qualities, real strengths that you brought to
Yeah.
that. And it's difficult because while it was such a success, it also caused so much suffering in the end. And when you look back on that time, do you see those strengths? Do you see those qualities? How do you kind of connect with some of the elements of you that you did bring to all of that?
Yeah, I think some people always try and ask me questions like, what was the worst thing in modeling, and try and make it very catastrophic and demonize it. And, I actually start with like modeling saved my life. It
Mm.
gave me an opportunity to know that I was good at something. Like, I mean, for the entirety of my school, I thought I was worthless and stupid and not worthy of achieving anything of success. And when you actually look at what the Oxford Dictionary terms as success, it's fame, wealth, and social status. That's the actual terminology that we're like given as we're growing up in the Oxford Dictionary. And so, ironically, at 19, I had all of that. I had a house in London that I bought on my own. I was flying to New York. I was shooting with the biggest brands in the world. I was in the press. I had the epitome of like what success was. But actually, when I got there, I didn't know who the hell I was, and didn't hadn't had time to figure that out. And so I'm so grateful for what I went through. Like, I would not change any part of my journey. I met some of the most amazing people. They made me believe in myself. They showed me that I was very creative. But at the same time, the pressure of that industry is something that you don't prepare for. And so it did build me resilience. But I think and I think resilience is one of the biggest things that you need in life. And I think if you don't go through hard times, you never build that resilience. And you can always tell from the difference of conversations that you have with people whether they have been through some really tough times, because they've come out in a very resilient, logical state where they've understood more about who they are because they've had to go through it. And I think that's a really amazing character trait. And so I'm actually quite grateful for everything I went through, because if I didn't go through that, I probably wouldn't have gone into health. I wouldn't have had to dig deep to figure this all out. And if I was never spotted as a model, I don't know if I would have ever gone to university. I might have never been diagnosed as dyslexic. So all of
Mm.
those things, I think, play into who I am and the mission that I'm building. But I do think that, it's very dependent on that person.
Mm.
I could have ended up with, never wanting to figure this out, and basically maybe being very ill for the rest of my life from the
Mm.
stress and the pressure, or just given up entirely. So I
Mm.
think, I had the resilience there, not from the modeling, but from the years of being told at school that I wasn't smart enough.
Ah.
And so I think I already had a big amount of resilience going into modeling. And
Mm.
I think that actually helped me power through. And I think you'll find that with a lot of people that feel very different, or maybe are neurodivergent, that they've had to figure out a way to survive through school, which isn't built for them. And that journey for me, I think, gave me the right footing to be able to start off to have a very successful career.
Mm.
Because I actually had quite a lot of confidence being thrown into the unknown and
Mm.
figuring out, how do I like problem solve this?
Mm. Yes, I know.
So
I know you ended up in
yeah,
small kind of, apartment rooms, by
yeah.
yourself, young person trying to survive in these strange international cities. And, there was an enormous amount of resilience already there. But I suppose you kind of alluding to the idea of resilience with wisdom too, like if we are resilient, but we just keep going and keep going and keep going at something that is actually wearing us away, depleting us, making us unwell, then that's not sort of perhaps as ideal either, or something. That there's a kind of a resilience plus this awareness and wisdom about when change is actually probably important too.
Yeah, I think wisdom is like such an important note. I had a conversation with Dr. John Vervaeke, who is an incredible philosopher at the University of Toronto, and he talks a lot about wisdom. And I think, that is one thing that you just can't buy. You have to learn, you have to go through life. And normally the people that go through the hardest moments are the most wisest. And my mum always said to me this amazing thing, I think, when I was going through different hardships in my life, whether it was personal or work or whatever. She said, it's really interesting, Sarah. You go through your whole life learning so many different things. And then you get to the end of your life and you die and it all goes.
Right.
And I thought,
Okay.
when you get to the end of your life, you're the most wisest you've ever been. And then you never really put that in, you obviously try and pass that down as much as you
Pass it
can,
on.
but you
Yeah.
kind of have to go through it yourself. And I'm not sure you can
Yes.
remember maybe being in your early 20s and someone trying to give you all this life advice. And you never
Mm.
really grasp and take it as much as you maybe do when you're 40,
Mm.
because you've had the life experiences then to connect to it so much more. And I do find that so interesting that you spend your whole life learning and
Mm.
adjusting and growing, and then you're probably the wisest you ever are when you're 80, and then it goes. And you
Well,
try and
well,
pass
maybe
down as much as you can.
Maybe it circles us back to the beginning, though. It's sort of it's a bit about passing that on, but it's also becoming the role
Mm,
model yourself. And that the
this
wisdom
is the
is
thing.
brought to we all bring our wisdom to, yeah, just sort of role modeling life in a way, and in a sense, not necessarily telling other people, what is best or something, but just sort of showing them through our actions, maybe
Yeah.
even inspiring through our actions, which is certainly what you're doing. There was a good quote too that I noticed from you. Severe restriction of food over time doesn't just affect how we look on the outside, it affects how we think and how we feel on the inside too. And you alluded to mind and body, I suppose, a moment ago.
Mm.
Can you expand on your thinking in amongst all that?
Yeah, it's such a big connection, and I think so many of us don't talk about it a lot. But it's something, when I first started treating patients years ago, people would come in for one thing and one outcome, which was just food. But you kind of miss the disconnection, as what I was talking about, the mind and the body is very connected. And I think a lot of people will understand that, the brain is the second gut, second mind, and we have this like incredible bi-directional connection between our brain and our gut, and they are in constant communication. But it's also every single cell in our body. Our thoughts influence our metabolism, they influence our biology, our physiology. And again, the nutrients that we have also influences so much of like how our body responds. It's a vehicle, right? It's like putting in diesel into a petrol car. If you're feeding it incorrectly, it will over time, break down and it won't run as efficiently. And so we kind of look at health, especially even in nutrition, as just like one silo and one vertical. And we kind of forget that there's another kind of connection that's vital, which is our mind. So I'm very, very passionate about understanding that, about understanding how the nutrients that we consume affect, how we're feeling, not just how we're looking and like the physical results that one might want, but also like our mental health, our immunity, all of these things are so interconnected. And then how we're thinking about things when we're consuming them and eating them, because that has as much as an effect as the nutrients that you're consuming. And so we're sadly like not piecing these things together. We're only looking at, well, am I having 30 plant-based foods a week? Am I having a diverse range of foods? Am I having a balanced diet? All of these things are really important. But if you're doing that from also a very negative lens and a very negative viewpoint, it will affect how you metabolize those nutrients.
Mm.
And so we've got to be thinking as like the brain and the body as one machine together, as opposed to two very separate things.
Mm. It's not just that it's sort of bi-directional or something. I suppose that was the first word that came to mind as I was listening to you. It's actually
Mm.
a real integration that the nutrition and the thoughts are happening together really, and
Yeah.
integrating together. Can you just sort of elaborate there a little bit in terms of the thoughts and the lens that we're seeing things through, sort of alongside the nutrition? How does that work?
Yeah, so we talk about kind of, as you said, like the bi-directional. That's a very common terminology now that's used today with the gut and the mind. But I look at it as a whole body connection. And so everything is connected as one, as opposed to two things that join and connect, because that's how we're now seeing it. I mean, for years we saw the 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 brain and the body as kind of two separate entities.
Yeah.
And Sir Ken Robinson talks about this very beautifully on one of the best TED Talks of all time, like Do Schools Kill Creativity? And he says very wonderfully in this talk, he was a psychologist, that a woman came to see him one day with a child and said, I'm really worried about her. And he was talking and he said, just let her go and be in that room and let's talk to the side. So the mother was like, I'm very worried about her. She doesn't sit down in class. She's very disruptive. And kind of saying, maybe we should look at medication. And do you think this is the right route? And as the mother is talking, he's listening and looks to the side where the daughter is in this other room and she's just dancing to this music. And he
Mm.
turns around to the mother and said, she's not sick. She doesn't need medication. She needs to dance. She needs to be creative. And she, I think she had ADHD, but she went on to be one of the biggest choreographers in the world. Like she was the person who created Cats, Phantom of the Opera. And actually, he was saying that, we very much treat at school everything from like the neck up as opposed to everything together. And I remember
Right.
listening to that story whilst I was studying nutrition and understanding about the importance of mental well-being and food and everything coming together and thinking, yeah, that's how we treat health. We treat everything very separate. We'll go to the gym because we want to look good in our muscles and we want to, keep our bodies in trim, and strength training and resistance training and all those things that we know is really good for the body. And then we go to therapy and we think, well, that's very good for our mind. But we never think about this as like one full connection, like how actually we shouldn't be looking at these as two separate entities. And so a very good kind of study that came out that can help explain how nutrition plays a big part in the full body connection was from Stanford, from Alia Crum, who works very, very specifically on mindset. And she gave a group of participants that were totally randomized. She put them into two different groups and she gave them a meal to eat. And then after they had that meal, they drew blood and said, we're going to do some genetic testing. And then they came back in a week later into exactly the same situation. And she delivered results back to them. And to half of the group, she said, look, you've got this gene called the FTO gene. And that means that you're predisposed to be obese, which basically means if you actually look at that gene, it's very, very small. But she was telling them that actually they have this predisposition. And she gave them lots of materials to read around it. And so they'd really like ingrained in their mind, oh my gosh, I am, more predisposed than I ever thought than I was to obesity. And then she said to the other group, oh, luckily enough, you don't actually have this gene, so you metabolize food very, very well. And then she put them in exactly the same setting again. And bearing in mind, because it was randomized, it didn't mean that they had this gene or not. It was just information that was given to them. And the ones that ate the meal the second time, all of their hunger hormones changed. Their ghrelin decreased, so they actually weren't as full, they overate. And just because of what they told those participants, they had a different outcome of one, how might they metabolize that food hormonally and how they reacted to it, compared to the other group that didn't. And the group that didn't actually ate less and didn't have any of those hormonal changes. And so it's really interesting that exactly the same situation, exactly the same scenario, that your body reacts completely differently to the food that you consume just from what you're being told. And so that's where the mindset piece comes in so dramatically, that if we're consuming foods every day, whether it's a restrictive mindset, whether it's something that you're on a really intense protocol and you're wanting to do this and you're not wanting to kind of derail because you know that then you failed and it's not good enough and you're not going to be as good as your peers or the people that you listen to on podcasts that are telling you this. All of that information is actually becoming quite detrimental. It's increasing your stress response. And we know that when cortisol's high, that increases inflammation. So all of these things play into how we should be consuming our food, how we should be looking at our diet. And, this is a podcast all about compassion. And that's something that I found to be kind of the antidote to all of this, because we do live in these high stressful situations. We do have, these pressures on us that we do feel that we want to be healthy and maybe, live a certain lifestyle. But we've got to do it from a compassionate lens, because actually when we start forgiving ourselves and knowing that failure is part of being human and it's all data and we can learn from it and we can grow from it, we will have these moments of failings because we're normal, but we're actually not going to ignite all of these metabolic responses that we would do before, because we're kind of giving ourselves a bit of space to breathe and go, okay, that happened. I can see that. And again, that reflective process that I spoke about, which increases resilience, you take a step back, you realize, and then you go again. Whereas if you don't have that, that stress response, that hormonal response just keeps going. And very much that is kind of what happened to me when I was 23, where I didn't have that moment to stop. So the integration of the mind and the body is such an important one when it comes to health, especially food, with how we're looking at the food that we're consuming.
It's quite amazing, isn't it? That it makes sense that expectancies might influence behavior and choices, but to see that it influences things at a hormonal level or at a very, kind of biological level is really striking, actually. And
Yeah.
I can see what you mean, that if we're kind of approaching things from a more self-critical point of view and perhaps even a shame-based self-criticism and especially around body image or food
Mhm.
and so on, and nutrition, then that's going to kind of, yes, trickle down to all these aspects of the self, physically as well as emotionally, versus a more self-compassionate approach.
Well, it's interesting because inflammation is the starter of any disease. So in the UK, dementia is the biggest killer. In the US, cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer. And they're both, started from inflammatory processes, plaques in the brain or plaques in the arteries. They're all started from inflammation. And stress is one of the leading causes of inflammation. And so we
Mm,
kind of have this disconnect of like, if you've got cardiovascular disease or you're at risk of a heart attack, we'll go, okay, well, we'll put you on the DASH diet because that's going to, help with supporting a reduction of cardiovascular disease. But no one talks about the mindset, the stress that people are under, because that's
mm,
also causing all the inflammation.
mm,
And so like not treating these in silos is really important. Again, very similarly to dementia, which I think so many people are terrified about getting. We'll talk about, well, type 3 diabetes is now linked to dementia. So let's not have sugar in our diet. Let's try and control our blood glucose levels. Let's try and not eat ultra processed foods. But you could be doing all of these things. And if you are doing it from a place that you hate yourself and that you're stressed all the time, that's also a massive cause of inflammation. So we've got to really be looking at this as like the holistic picture, that the mind is not separate. And if you just do these like 5 things with your diet or these 5 things with exercise, that you're not going to get these diseases, because now we are living in an environment where we're constantly surrounded by stress, and they might not be life or death, but it's a constant thing, especially as we were talking about that TV program, Adolescence.
mm.
Imagine like how many times you're bombarded with information. I think it's something like we have 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day.
Oh,
And it's around like 70 to 80% of those thoughts are negative. Like that's huge,
yeah.
And so if we're kind of thinking about how much information we're taking and how much negativity we're potentially consuming, that's all having an
Mm,
effect on our physiology. So it's like trying to have that awareness of that full picture,
mm.
for our health.
Yes, as Paul Gilbert, who you interviewed, would say, we have
Yeah,
tricky brains, sort of thing,
we
and
do.
we
We have
do.
no manuals for them.
No, it is tricky. Um, what do you think about the integration of body, mind, and social? Because you've spoken about loneliness too, and that, that
Mm.
that this is something that people face. Perhaps it does also you sort of feed back into inflammatory processes or that sort of thing, inflammatory processes. But yeah, what are your thoughts there about the social aspect to our species and how that perhaps plays a role in an integrated way as well?
Yeah, I think it's such a big thing. I think everyone will say like things as we're in an obesity epidemic or we're in a mental health epidemic, but I really believe we are in a loneliness epidemic, and it's only
Mm,
becoming more and more prominent. I think when I was younger, I would just have said, the elderly are the most loneliest generation, because I would look at my grandparents, and sadly both my grandparents my grandfathers died way before my grandmothers died, so they kind of
mm,
lived on their own for the last 10 years, and that's how I related loneliness. I was like, oh, they don't have their spouse, and sadly they passed away. But actually now we look at data and it's like it's the younger generation that are the most risk of loneliness. Even men's mental health, suicide risk is so high in young males. And so much, if you look at this, it's like because we're so lonely, we're more than ever, we're not in communities. Even for me, for instance, I live in London. My parents live a couple of hours away. I don't have that. I'm incredibly close to them, but I don't have that where I pop around and see my parents, 3 or 4 times a week for dinner, which is what they did with their parents because they only lived a few roads away. And so we've become more curious than ever as a society, which means that we're kind of spreading our wings a lot more and traveling a lot more and experiencing the world a lot more, which is wonderful in so many ways, but we're doing it in a very isolated form. We're not as connected to communities anymore. And, a lot of us will be able to cancel plans within, a couple of hours because you just send a message. And I think one of those things that I learned being a model very young and going off and not having that university experience and not creating that kind of tight bonds, was that I lived on my own in apartments from 18,
mm,
and I was a very fluid in where I was working and who I was working with. Every day was a different crew. So I never had long enough to form these like big bonds with people who understood where I was, which was in a way quite good because I became a very adaptable person and you could put me in many situations because I had to learn. But on the other way, I didn't become close enough with anyone to form a bond that's really important. And we know the longest study from Harvard, which was a longitudinal study, found that people that lived the longest had the most supportive relationships. And it wasn't
Relationships.
just a romantic relationship, it was communities, it was people where they felt supported. And very similarly to the Blue Zones, Dan Buettner, he'll look at the longest living people in the world, centenarians. And in all of these Blue Zones, communities is one of like the biggest things that helps people live longer because they feel very supported. And now we're creating, people don't go and live with their families when they're older. They're in a care home on their own. They're very isolated. People are more single and not having children than ever before. We are people having more careers, and there's so many like wonderful parts of that, but at the same time, we are very fragmented and we're very disconnected. And we actually know that that is a huge, huge, huge indicator for our longevity and our health. It's
Mm,
massive.
mm.
And so all of these kind of feel good hormones that are released when we hug someone or when we feel supported by someone or when we feel seen by someone, huge indicators of our health. And I think we think that we might be connected to people because we WhatsApp them. I have friends all over the world that I'm friends with, but I'm not seeing them. I'm not in contact with them. And you're actually then spending so much time isolated on your own. And so I think that is something that we're going to see as a huge problem in the next 20 years. And even
Mm.
more so as AI is developing. I think the problem that it might sound crazy, but I think the problem that we are going to start seeing is people are going to be having online relationships with AI. And people are going to believe, that they are real. But it's a computer. And I think, people will be having support mechanisms that are built predominantly online. And it's worrying, but I think that is where we're heading. So I think, more than ever, human connection is something that we really need to be aware of.
Yeah, you said the little word hug or hugs, and we are so sort of built to co-regulate and to down-regulate in the presence of others, and with that kind of physical touch and physical affection and that sense of closeness and connection, and it doesn't quite come through WhatsApp or that sort of thing, or actually even so much a phone call in some ways. A phone call
Yeah.
might be a bit better, but there is something about that closeness and connection and physical contact that I
Mm-hmm.
guess sort of activates that soothing system, doesn't it? That ability to feel calm and safe, really, and
Yeah.
that's often the big kind of antidote to the threat system or to the stress response that you were talking
Mm-hmm.
about before.
Hugely. I also think it teaches us empathy a lot more, because when you can empathize with someone, you feel a very big drawn of connection. And actually, if we're losing that connection to people, we're going to start losing, our way to empathize because we don't have the need to use that. And empathy is something that is like learned and understood and grown and fostered. But if we're becoming more disconnected, we're going to becoming more like unempathetic. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we are actually missing today
Mm,
in our society. We know, like with team building, even in like the Navy SEALs, who has kind of one of the most like important team buildings of all time, like empathy is one of the biggest things that they talk about to get them through. And so that is one of the most important things for connection, for that human connection that we have. And
mm,
if we're actually disconnected, I really worry that we're going to lose the muscle of empathy that is so important for that. So I think that's something to kind of
mm.
also, think about.
To think about and to kind of actively practice. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if this makes sense for you, but traditionally, historically, even evolutionarily, we would eat together as well. That would be a
Yeah.
really key part of the social group, gathering around the hearth, so to speak, or sort of
Yeah.
breaking bread, or kind of having a meal together, and even with our babies, that's often a part of soothing. Might be, kind of so. Yeah, it all sort of ties back in, doesn't it, to that integrated sense that you bring.
Hmm. Yeah, I think. eating together is so, I talk about this a lot, but, eating together in communities. I mean, we were brought up in tribes. If you just look at evolution,
Mm.
no one was brought up solely on their own. We're not animals that, we're not any mammal that lives on their own. That's meant to. That's not how evolution has played out. We've always lived in tribes and communities together. And we've just become more and more distant over time. And that's not our natural way of being, but it's become very natural now. Um, and so I think, how many people sit around a meal together and share their meal times? Probably half the amount than our grandparents did.
Mm.
We do have more fluidity in our lives and flexibility more than ever before, but we're becoming quite lone rangers. And I do think it's important to be very aware of that. And it's not just the slowing down of eating when you're with people, because that's what it does. You're in conversation, you're talking more, you're less focused on eating very quickly, which we know isn't good for our health, but you're also sharing about your day, you're hearing about other people's day. You're kind of also getting maybe out of your mind and connecting and having that empathy with other people, which is such an important behavior for health. And allowing yourself to kind of disconnect from the stresses of the day, to sit down with a family, or a friend or a partner is so important. But with that, we've lost that, and we've lost cooking at the same time.
Mm.
And so less and less people are cooking at home and making nourishing meals and knowing what's in their food, because you've lost all of these like other practices that kind of hold that together. So it's much easier now just to order on an app. And it's not that I'm not saying this is bad, because I do this. I'm
Mm.
speaking from things that I do, even though I know kind of the problems with this. I am very much responsible for doing something very similar.
Mm.
But the convenience factor when it's there in front of you is very hard to resist, because the brain is, I don't think people realize this, but the brain is so lazy. And that's why it's harder for people to stick to a healthy diet if they're surrounded by ultra processed foods, or, the unhealthier options, because it's easy to grab. Whereas if I took all of those healthy options and put them 25 minutes down the road and said, oh, you can have them, but you have to go and get them, your brain's so lazy. It's like, oh, I can't be bothered. I'm not going to go down and do that. And so actually, like, creating those frictions is really important. But what we've done is we've increased all the convenience and the access so easily that the brain goes, well, this is such an easy option. I can just order it on an app and it can come in 2 minutes. Why would I drive to the shops, do my shopping, come home, cook my dinner? Because we've made this lifestyle and this environment that's so much easier in other ways, that we've kind of lost the fundamentals of these kind of important aspects.
I mean, maybe rather than lazy, the brain is just efficient. It's very efficient at reserving
Mm,
its resources and the energy levels. But it's certainly meant that we've put our brain to making things easier, I suppose. And there's this
mm,
kind of societal drift, isn't there, towards or away from what seems to be best for our well-being. Well, we've
yeah.
covered a lot of ground. I know you've got a really busy day ahead. We established firstly that dogs are better than cats, so okay, that's that's one important piece. But no, this kind of 360-degree approach that you take, the mind and the body, that the nutrition isn't just really about affecting things like appearance. It's this really holistic thing, and the mind and body and really our social context, I guess, in some ways, are one. What would be three key things, three tips, that sort of thing? Like what might people go away and just kind of reflect on a bit after hearing you and maybe even put into practice?
I would say, well, I can't not say compassion on a compassionate podcast, can I?
Yes, please do.
So I'm gonna start there. I'm very thankful for you highlighting this message that can feel very cringe to many people when they first start connecting with compassion and self-compassion anyway, because I think trying to tell an English person that they love themselves makes them cringe and worry. And I heard from Oliver Berkman, that when you feel the cringe, lean into it, because that's actually where you got to do the work. And so I loved when he said that, and it made things feel
Mm,
much more comfortable.
that's good.
So I would say lean into the cringe and lean into self-awareness of like, how compassionate are you? So if there's one question that you could ask yourself, it is, would I say this to a friend? Or how would I respond if a friend came to me with this problem or this worry? Because we all wake up with worries and thoughts and criticisms every day. But we very rarely would respond the way that we do to a friend. And I find that's one of the easiest ways to connect to self-compassion. That if you wouldn't give that advice to a friend, then don't give that advice to yourself. If you would give that advice to a friend, then give that advice to you.
Mm.
And it's very a relatable approach. So that's probably the first one to say, which I think we can all do, and have more awareness of that. The second one would be three pieces of advice. To give yourself a bit of a break. I think that's a huge one that is something that I've had to learn. And we kind of never allow ourselves that. So actually like taking a beat and giving ourselves a break and actually say, haven't I given myself a break? And the third thing is to do something that you love for 10 minutes every day. And I think if you can do that, give yourself just 10 minutes of something that you love, that you enjoy, that gives you happiness, then you allow that time for you. And so they kind of all flow into one another.
Mm.
But I think too often we don't ever do something that we do just for enjoyment. And
Mm.
that's one of the biggest like de-stressors that we can do. And it also builds on things of finding out stuff that we love more. I think we've packed our days with too many to-do lists, too many protocols, too many things for, wanting to be the best. And I think actually giving yourself a break and doing something that you love for 10 minutes a day is what we start to need to kind of implement to build health behaviors. So they're probably my
Beautiful.
three things.
The self-compassion helps to down-regulate threat system. The giving yourself a break helps you to activate soothing system, and then the doing something you love takes you out to drive system and exploring the world and you know enjoying yourself and having fun. Well, great. Well, Sarah Ann Macklin, thank you. Well, for all of the work that you do, I'll put all the links, of
Thank
course, in
you.
the description and the description below, as they say. And also thank you for being on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for sharing a very important message of compassion.